Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor at Howard University, and I host the Slaveryarchive Book Club along with my co-hosts, Alex Hill, who is here with us. Alex is at Columbia University, and also Vanessa Holden, who is at University of Kentucky. Jessica Johnson from Johns Hopkins. She also is a co-host of the Slaveryarchive Book Club. She is not here with us today. Then let me introduce our speaker today, who is the author of this beautiful book, Until Justice Be Done, Kate Masur. And I'll introduce her, and then Kate will present the book. Kate Masur, she received her PhD from the University of Michigan in 2001. She specializes in the history of race, politics, and law in 19th century United States. And she's the author of the book you just saw that you are going to be discussing today, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement, from the Revolution to Reconstruction. And this is a book that was published then by Norton in 2021. Then this year it was published then indeed a few weeks ago. And she's also the author of several other books and articles, including then An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle over Equality in Washington, D.C., that was published in 2010 by University of North Carolina Press. And she also co-authored with Gregory Downs, The World the Civil War Made, that was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2015. Masur, she has consulted extensively with museums and art organizations, also including then the National Constitution Center and the Newberry Library. She was also part of the editorial team that created the project Reconstruction, the official National Park Service handbook. And she also co-authored with Gregory Downs the era of Reconstruction, 1861-1900, a national historic landmark theme study that was published in 2017. She was also a key consultant for the 2019 documentary, Reconstruction America, the First Civil War, that appeared in the recent CNN film, Lincoln, Divided We Stand. She also works regularly with K-12 teachers, and she speaks also with the media on topics including then the Civil War and Reconstruction, Lincoln, and monuments and public memory. And she and Gregory Downs are co-editors of the Journal of the Civil War Era that is published by the University of North Carolina Press. Masur's scholarship recently appeared in the Journal of the Civil War Era, the American Journal of Legal History, also in volumes on the Memphis Massacre, and biographical film in history. And as a commentary also in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and the Washington Post's session made by History. Currently, Kate, she is working on two different projects. One is a website on African-American life and activism in Illinois in the 1840s and 1850s, in collaboration with the Colored Conventions project that you are going to feature this book indeed here. I believe it's next Wednesday, or if it's not next Wednesday, it's going to be in 2 weeks from now. In addition to that, she is working on a graphic history of Reconstruction in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. area, that was commissioned by the National Park Service. And I hope I made justice to all these wonderful projects that Kate has been working on. And we are very pleased to be here to discuss the book. Now I pass the floor to Kate.
All right, and thanks. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the introduction. And thank you to everyone who is here enduring yet another Zoom talk. I hope we'll make it worthwhile. I just want to thank the Slaveryarchive Book Club. I so love what you all have done over the last year plus, and I know it's so much work to administer, and I just think it's such a service, and it's been such a wonderful thing to be able to drop in on and kind of be part of from time to time. Before I start, and with permission from the hosts, I wanted to quickly say something about the journal that I co-edit with Greg Downs. It's the Journal of the Civil War Era. And the reason I wanted to mention it is because I want people here to know about the journal and to think if your work at all intersects with the history of the United States, primarily in the mid-19th century, please think about the journal as a place where you might publish. I know it's called the Journal of the Civil War Era, but we are by no means exclusively focused on the Civil War itself. We are very eclectic in our interest in what we publish. We're very, very interested in publishing scholarship on African-American history, broadly speaking, on the history of slavery and emancipation, and comparative and international approaches to those topics. And so I hope that people who are attending will think about our journal as a place to submit articles. We have a website for the journal. You can read more about it. There's a video about our kind of submission and editorial practices up there. And of course, just reach out to me if you have any questions. And I also just want to say, since becoming editor in January of 2020, I have been really surprised by how few articles we receive over the transom from women authors. And I know that my participation in the journal has intersected with the pandemic, which has disproportionately probably affected women scholars, but I just wanted to kind of put a special plug in for women authors. We, of course, we're interested in all authors, but you know, it's very surprising being on the inside of a journal and seeing that kind of discrepancy that we do see. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Greg if you are at all interested in submitting something, or you're wondering if it might be an appropriate venue for work that you're doing. I'll just really quickly mention the journal is sponsoring a National Day of Action for Good History on September 18th. This is building on something that we did a year ago, and so look out for the blog Muster, which is our blog. It's edited by Hillary Green, and our Twitter feed, it's at JCWE1 for more information on that. And we'd love for you to get involved. That involves kind of going out to historic sites and doing kind of history in public to emphasize both histories, particularly of African Americans that have been underrepresented and not really told in public, and also talking about the ways that particular kinds of monuments kind of further lost cause narratives. We want to sort of disrupt that and tell real stories about history. So stay tuned for that. And if you're interested, again, just feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so on to my book. I'm really happy to be able to talk with you today about my book. I'm going to give a kind of more formal presentation, and then I'm really happy to talk about any aspect of it. So things I did touch on in the presentation, things that I don't touch on, and also anything that people might want to talk about in terms of pulling back the curtain on I don't know, you know, if you're like writing a second book, doing a book after your dissertation, or, you know, the process of writing this book, or anything is fair game as far as I'm concerned. So with that, let me share my screen. Is that working for you? Yeah, okay. And where I always can't find the slideshow thing, there it is. My screen went completely blank for a moment. Are you still seeing my screen share?
Yes, perfect.
But are you seeing it in the slideshow view or no?
It's slideshow. Mm-hmm.
It is? Okay, so then yes. if I advance, are you seeing the next slide?
Okay, now you have the cover. You can. Okay.
Wait, all right, I'm sorry about this.
It's fine. This is what the book club is like. We are
This is better for me. No, that was better. All right, no, sorry, my bad. All right, wait, we're going back. What's happening is the thing where once I share the slideshow, it takes over my screen, and then I won't be able to see
it's the arrows. Okay, the arrows for you to use your keyboard to advance, they are on the left side at the bottom.
Yeah, that I can do. I just want to minimize it so I can also see my paper. Hold on one second. Okay, so what the problem is that I've got it on screen mirroring. So it's like, it takes over my screen. That's weird.
Now you choose the way that you prefer. If you think that you don't need the
But right now I'm not screen sharing, right?
no.
All right, you know what? I'm just gonna forego the slideshow then, because
Okay.
it was some nice illustrations, but I think I don't, yeah, I think it's too complicated.
Yeah, what you can do is at the end, at the very end, you can just show images if you want to share. And like this, we see you as well, which is nice.
Okay.
We see
Okay.
your whole.
All right, let's go. Okay, so this book, Until Justice Be Done, I'm going to begin now with where the book begins, which is a vignette about Columbus, Ohio. In the summer of 1843, in Ohio, state laws imposed an array of special requirements on Black people. African Americans who wanted to live in the state were supposed to register with local officials, getting 2 landholders to post bonds for their good behavior. Black people were not permitted to testify in court cases involving whites, and Black children were barred from public education. These explicitly racist laws were known as the Black Laws. In addition, the state constitution reserved the right to vote for white men only. The men who gathered in Columbus in the summer of 1843, among them teachers, ministers, and laborers, created a 4-person committee that issued an appeal to white residents of the state. They called on white Ohioans to recognize the injustice of their laws, insisting that the government's policy toward them was utterly at variance with the promises of the Declaration of Independence. State laws, they said, should constitute the bulwark of our liberties. And yet Ohio law was, quote, employed as the instrument to hunt us down to degradation and shame. The group wanted white Ohioans to see the world through their eyes. Their own state denied their fundamental rights, while just to the south, the slave state of Virginia and Kentucky were even worse. And they wrote in their address, is life secure? Is liberty inviolate? Is the pursuit of happiness left open to us when the hand of the ruffians can be raised against our existence with impunity, when the legislatures of adjoining states hesitate not to enact laws which militate against freedom, and the laws of our own state may be construed to deprive us of the enjoyment of liberty. Now, this address was published in Columbus's Black newspaper, the Palladium of Liberty, and it well expressed the demands of Ohio African-American activists and their white allies that the state's racist laws were unjust and an embarrassment to a free state. And the question was, what could be done about these laws? In 1843 and throughout the pre-Civil War decades, the Black population of Ohio was about 1% of the total, and Black men, as I said, were not permitted to vote. Could a sufficient number of white voters be persuaded of the injustice of the Black laws to repeal them? The answer to that question and similar questions of race, politics, and power forms a large part of the story I tell in this book. So the book describes a substantial, wide-ranging debate about race and civil rights in the free states from the late 18th century through the Civil War. I show that across this period, and particularly from the 1820s to the 1850s, a broad-based movement for racial equality in civil rights emerged and made significant headway in politics. Now, I think that we've often failed to see this movement because our focus has been elsewhere. In classes, for example, we talk about abolitionists and the great Civil War, pre-Civil War debate over slavery itself and the causes of the sectional crisis. Historians have also written about the history of Northern Black communities. But I think what we've missed in many ways was the struggle over the rights and status of free African Americans in the free states. And this is really important, that those states were in many respects post-slavery societies. And people here will know this. At the time of the American Revolution, slavery was legal throughout the British North American colonies. And as northern states moved to abolish slavery, their free free Black populations grew and were augmented by people who migrated northward from the slave states in search of a better life. So then what ensued in the free states was really a debate about what a post-slavery society should look like. And in this context, many white Americans insisted that there was no place in the nation for free Black people or any people of color. They argued that free African Americans should leave the country. And this is basically sort of the American Colonization Society argument, that this development of having a nation where slavery was at one point legal everywhere, begin to abolish slavery in certain places and creating free African Americans even in the slave states was going to be a very big problem. And so the American Colonization Society, which formed in the end of the 18 teens, their vision for the United States was a vision that in which the presence of free African Americans was basically an impossibility. And in many respects, I see the repressive, explicitly racist laws of places like Ohio, which I'll talk about in a second, as another expression of a vision of a place where free African Americans are not welcome, are not vested with full panoply of kind of rights and privileges that white people can expect, are marginalized and not considered sort of fully part of the body politic or the society. And so these kinds of visions of what would happen to African Americans or people of African descent after slavery was abolished in a particular jurisdiction, right? Because we're not yet talking about the abolition of slavery nationwide, which kind of happened as a result of the Civil War, but beginning with Northern abolition, created these conversations about what should happen next. The people who I write about being part of what I call the first civil rights movement proposed a different vision for a post-slavery society. They came, and that was one that was much more inclusive, right? These people came from a variety of different perspectives, and I emphasize sort of again and again that they didn't agree among themselves about how far their demands should go, but they did come together around one important idea, and that was that a multiracial society composed of free people was indeed possible, and that when it came to civil rights, laws that drew distinctions based on race were unjust, and they framed them as being un-American. African Americans led the way in this movement. Black people, among them, people like those who gathered in Columbus in 1843, who I began with, espoused the era's broadest vision of democracy. But African Americans alone could not bring about the policy changes needed to repeal racist laws in the northern states or force the federal government not only to abolish slavery, but to pledge protection for the basic rights of all people. So the book explains how white Northerners also participated in the movement for racial equality, using their power as voters, as editors and lawyers and politicians to make lasting change at every level of American life. I see this movement as interesting in its own right, but also important for its lasting impact. By the late 1850s, this movement had pushed its ideas about racial equality from the margins of politics to the center in Northern politics. Its ideas took root in the Republican Party, whose leaders shared a commitment to the principle of racial equality before the law. When they were empowered during the Civil War, Republicans implemented this vision where they believed they had power to do so under the Constitution. The Lincoln administration, for example, declared African American citizens of the United States, welcomed Black diplomats from Haiti, and eventually equalized pay between Black and white soldiers. Then, when the war ended, Republicans extended the principle of racial equality and civil rights into the states. So in the end, I argue by the end of the book that the decades-long social and political movement that I describe gave shape to the nation's first federal civil rights measures, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. As a historian, I've always been interested in how power and political power and governing works. And so my approach in the book is shaped by an interest in how people try to make political change and at what levels of government in this nation's highly complex and multi-layered political system they address. And so this means thinking a lot about federalism. Are the questions that people were dealing with, are the fights that they were fighting, did they fight them at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level? And like what kinds of changes were possible at each level, particularly given the kind of constitutional structure of the United States. So that's, in a way, my orientation as a historian. That's just kind of the stuff I end up seeming to think about a lot. So in general, in the book, I trace two main axes of struggle, state level and federal level. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So if I were showing the slides, I would show you just a really basic map of the United States with the Northwest Territory showing. And the Northwest Territory was composed in 1787 of the states that are now, or the area it's now, the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so this is kind of the Midwest before you get to the Mississippi River. So I sort of begin and spend a lot of time on Ohio because the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 abolished slavery in the Northwest Territory with like the caveat that slavery already existed and it didn't just go away right away when the Northwest Ordinance was passed. So yes, some people fought to continue slavery in that area, but it was kind of on its way out. And so, we're talking about a place that kind of came into the United States as a place where slavery was not going to be legalized. But when states started to be created out of that territory, beginning with Ohio, they immediately passed racially discriminatory laws. So these were places that were kind of born without slavery, and yet their legislatures, starting with Ohio in 1804, chose to adopt laws that discriminated explicitly against Black people in the ways that I mentioned above. So requiring Black residents to register with local officials, getting other people to post bonds for their good behavior, having to carry evidence of their freedom, prohibiting them from court cases prohibiting them from testifying in court cases involving whites, and eventually barring Black children from public schools, as well as denying Black men the right to vote. Now, one of the things that I point out in this book, and one of the things I got really interested in, was why people thought these laws were okay in the first place. So the laws, the anti-Black laws or Black laws, enjoyed a lot of legitimacy, not only because so many white Americans did not see free Black people as their equals or as fully vested members of their communities, but also because of the widespread view that states were fully entitled to determine the status and rights of their residents, including by drawing on what contemporaries called the police powers to impose regulations on people thought to be threatening to public peace or the common welfare. So states and municipalities regularly invoke the police powers, for example, to create and enforce fire codes, to regulate slaughterhouses. Police powers are also what states are drawing on when they enforce vaccine or mask mandates, for example. So there's a lot of power that the states had and continue to have to kind of tell people what to do. And particularly when they're able to justify the exercise of that power in the name of the public good, which is certainly the case really easily in the pandemic. And you can see, actually, this is like a wellspring of enormous amount of power, because many, many things that are both some things that we would consider to be really good and healthy, and other things that we would consider to be really dangerous, can all be justified under this kind of umbrella of, well, it's in the common good. It all depends on who's sitting in the legislature when they're talking about it. So in this period, back in the early 19th century, states drew on police powers, and within that kind of umbrella of giant amounts of power, they drew on poor law principles inherited from England to decide whether poor people who were newcomers to a community would receive relief or be involuntarily expelled and transported back to their place of origin. So there's a long history in British law, in English law going way back, and then transported into the British colonies of evaluating poor people and deciding whether they have a right to stay in a community or whether they can be kind of summarily removed if they become dependent, if they cannot support themselves. In Ohio and then in other Midwestern states, they built their racist residency laws on those poor laws, and actually intertwined the racist laws with the poor laws. To many white Americans, regulations that applied only to Black people were just another variety of regulating potentially poor or disruptive people, and they were very familiar and entirely acceptable. And I should add, the structure of the laws themselves depended on the poor laws. So it was the overseers of the poor literally the kind of local officials who are in charge of monitoring poor people in the community, who are charged with enforcing the Black laws as well. I found in my research that states tended to pass these laws and then repass them or update them, often in response to new policies in adjacent slave states, which in the early 19th century placed growing strictures on free Black residents. So when Virginia would kind of crack down on free African Americans, the Ohio legislature would start talking about it again. When Kentucky did something, Ohio would kind of respond. When Missouri did something, Illinois would respond. So you see these kind of patterns and almost dialogues among the state legislatures. In this context, right, legislators north of the Ohio River drew on poor law concepts to insist that free Black people were an undesirable population, much like paupers and vagrants. They often used that comparison. The idea was they would become dependent on public resources and a threat to public peace. They argued, these pro-Black law folks argued, that the states therefore must take steps to discourage migration of African Americans by adopting policies that subjected them to unpleasant and expensive legal processes. And everyone knew as well that when states passed these laws, they made Black people increasingly vulnerable to like vigilante violence. So when the state legislature is basically telegraphing that African Americans are not wanted in these states, that they aren't going to have the same kind of legal rights as white people, it also kind of helps white people who are not state officials to feel empowered to go after African Americans kind of at will, or when they decide that they feel kind of hostile to some neighbor of theirs. So this is sort of the situation. And my book explores how over the course of several decades, a movement arose to challenge these racist laws and demand their repeal. The central feature of the movement was that it condemned racial discrimination as such. So one of the people that I like to quote is a man who used the name David Blackmore and identified himself in his writing as African American. In 1817, writing for a newspaper run by Quaker abolitionist Charles Osborne in southeastern Ohio, David Blackmore invoked passages of the Bible that emphasized human equality and later became crucial to this movement and really to the abolitionist movement. It's a line from the Bible that says, God had made of one blood all nations of men. So basically saying, you know, we are all of one blood, and therefore any kind of distinction of blood or nation is inappropriate and goes against God's will. David Blackmore also quoted the kind of golden rule also in the Bible that we ought to do unto all men as we would wish them to do unto us. And the people I write about drew on the Bible. They also frequently invoke the Declaration of Independence and drew on kind of natural law ideas about human equality to combat to kind of make the argument that racial discrimination, race-based discrimination was wrong, was against natural law, was against what God would want. But David Blackmore also had an analysis of why the Ohio Black laws were bad public policy. When legislators, he's responding to legislators who suggested that the state would be quote unquote overrun with free Black migrants, or when those legislators expressed concern about the cost of their maintenance of those migrants. Blackmore said these were imaginary evils. And he added that if Black people were poor, it was because their forefathers had not been paid for their labor from the time they were brought to North America. Meanwhile, he argued that the racist residency laws opened the door to violence and abuse and didn't even serve their intended purpose of discouraging Black migration. And this was true. You can see from census data that the population of African Americans in the Midwestern states grew steadily over the decades from the 1820s to the 1860s at about the same rate as the growth of white population. And so really these laws were not effective in discouraging people from coming into the states in a way that's visible in those kind of aggregate numbers anyway. So in the book, I was very interested in how do you change public policy? And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how activists went about trying to make change and which venues they used, how they confronted challenges posed by the unpopularity of their ideas, their small numbers, especially at first, and by American federalism itself. I want to give you a sense of one of their key strategies, which was petitioning. And so you have to, sort of remember that Black men don't even have the right to vote, not to mention the fact that African Americans are about 1% of the population of a state like Ohio, and also that they have some white allies who are willing to go and do this too, might make the same arguments for repeal of the Black laws, but not nearly a kind of enough white folks to get enough people in the legislature to repeal the laws. So it's kind of an interesting question. What do you actually do? So in this case, Black and white activists, usually working in separate organizations, petitions the state legislatures to repeal the laws. Petitions would be referred to special legislative committees, which often returned with reports. When a committee divided, there would be a majority and a minority report. So even when anti-Black law petitioners failed to garner a positive majority report, which was most of the time, right? The committees were not reporting back saying, yes, let's repeal the laws. Those reports generated continuing debate, could be published in newspapers, and generally helped to amplify the cause. So to give an example, in 1835, the Ohio House of Representatives produced a report defending the Black laws as necessary to maintaining the public peace in the state. Of course, Ohio-based activists outraged were not surprised, probably. But in this case, William Lloyd Garrison picked up the Ohio report and published it in his newspaper, The Liberator, with a lengthy commentary lambasting the Ohio legislature for caring more about public opinion in neighboring slave states than about, quote, the rights of victims of racial oppression. And so there you see again and again the strategy when you're in a political minority of trying to draw attention to your cause, of trying to solicit support. And one of the ways to do it is to petition, and even getting these negative reports back, you use that as another opportunity to publicize, to recruit supporters, to talk about what the problem is. Now, I also talk a fair amount about party politics in this book, because the activists I write about wanted to get policies changed, and therefore they had to get people elected who agreed with them. The biggest success against the Midwestern Black laws came in Ohio, where neither the Whigs nor the Democrats were consistently dominant. So they were very evenly matched in the state. And this meant that third-party organizing could be very disruptive. And the people who wanted to repeal the Black laws actually did a great job of taking advantage of that. And so through kind of interesting, crafty moves that had to do with soliciting support from people in both major political parties and mobilizing through a third party, they end up getting most of those repellent laws repealed in the winter of 1849. I draw a contrast in the book with Illinois, where the Democrats were dominant. There wasn't this kind of evenly matched two parties. And so the movement made much less headway in the state legislature because they couldn't play the two parties off against each other as effectively. But by 1865, in fact, this movement did succeed in getting Illinois, when the Republicans were in power, and getting Illinois to repeal its Black laws. Okay, so on the one hand, I follow widespread state level efforts in the free states to repeal these racially discriminatory laws, but I also write about movements that emerged particularly strongly in Massachusetts, but also in New York, to defend the rights of free Black sailors in Southern ports. And this aspect of the movement concerned interstate issues and was therefore more likely to be able to invoke the US Constitution and reach the federal government. So far I've been talking about state level efforts. Starting, and if I had the slides, I would show you an affidavit from an African-American sailor named Joseph Thompson, who described his experience incarcerated in New Orleans. Starting with South Carolina in 1822, Southern states passed laws that explicitly targeted free Black sailors, requiring them, as was the case in South Carolina, to spend their time on shore in jail or to quarantine on their ships, or at the very least to carry passes wherever they went while in the port. Authorities in Southern port cities regularly used these laws as a pretext to arrest and incarcerate free Black sailors. And if they were not discovered and bailed out by ship captains or others, they could be sold from jail into lifelong slavery. And just to allude back to the discussion of police powers, when Southern legislators and Southern politicians were pressed on this issue, they would defend these statutes that clearly deprived free Black people of basic rights as proper exercises of the police powers of the state. So they argued, for example, as one lawyer did, that the state was empowered to, quote, guard against impending danger, and the state itself was the sole judge of the means necessary for self-preservation. And so these states were so afraid of the influence of free Black sailors, both from the US North and from the Caribbean and and who sailed on ships that were from England or from France, that they justified these laws on the basis that free Black sailors coming into ports were just so dangerous that we had to do, it didn't matter really what their supposed rights as free people were. The testimonies of Black sailors who had survived and escaped from Southern jails helped galvanize residents of Massachusetts and New York to action. So, for example, a ship's steward named Joseph Thompson in 1833 attested that he had been thrown in jail in New Orleans. Lucky for him, he knew French and managed to get word out through a jailer to two prominent white men who helped secure his release. But he explained when he returned to Boston that he had encountered numerous free Black Northerners incarcerated with no hope of release. And he said, quote, "A continual stream of free colored men from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and other seaports in the United States was passing through the New Orleans jail into slavery in the country." So again, what could people in Massachusetts do to stop South Carolina and its officials from so blatantly violating what seemed to be the rights of Black sailors to do their jobs, to move freely within the nation? It was not at all clear, and I'm not going to kind of go into the details of the constitutional order that the Constitution set up, but I mean, there was no clear, obvious reason why laws like those South Carolina laws would have been considered to be unconstitutional. The people that I write about argued that they were unconstitutional, but that was a kind of outsider type of argument, an argument that had to be kind of made in advance that most people did not believe. So in Massachusetts in the 1830s, movement activists pushed the state legislature to try to take some action about what they considered the abrogation of the rights of citizens of the state of Massachusetts. And in 1839, the state legislature finally did. It passed a measure that denounced Southern practices and authorized the governor of the state to use funds to secure the release of imprisoned sailors and others who had been stolen into slavery from Massachusetts. Now I would show you a slide of the Privileges and Immunities Clause from the Constitution, which is Article 4, Section 2 of the original Constitution. So these activists were not content with state level actions because after all, it's not very, okay, fine, they're going to pass a law, they're going to pass a resolution saying the governor can appropriate money to help get people out. They're going to denounce South Carolina, but come on, that's not really, as effective as trying to get South Carolina to stop with these policies, which by the way, other states also adopted, not just South Carolina. And so they escalated their claims to the federal level, arguing that Southern states' discriminatory laws violated the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the US Constitution. And that clause read, quote, "The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states." Now, Northerners, and I kind of write about this in the book, Northerners have been insisting since the Missouri crisis of 1820 and 1821 that the Privileges and Immunities Clause actually did give free Black people who were recognized as citizens of their home states the right to travel into other states. So galvanized by the plight of Black sailors in Southern ports, Black and white petitioners in New York, in Massachusetts, and even in Ohio petitioned Congress to take action to protect the rights of Black sailors under the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Some also looked to try to get a case about this into federal court to make the argument in court that those Southern laws were unconstitutional. Congress did not act. Which, if you know this period of U.S. history, you will not be surprised that Congress did not take action by passing a law saying that what these Southern states and these Southern laws were doing was unconstitutional or they had to stop. This Congress was dominated by slaveholders and their interests and their allies in the North, and weren't about to take an aggressive stand telling Southern states what to do on this matter. Meanwhile, the state of Massachusetts sent emissaries into Charleston and New Orleans to try to bring a case to federal court. And the Massachusetts guy was run out. They were both run out of those Southern cities in the case of Charleston under threat of mob violence. And so the effort to kind of send two guys from Massachusetts into these Southern states to bring a lawsuit, even in federal court, went nowhere kind of under the threat of violence. You cannot come into court and even challenge these laws in federal court in these states. So to bring these two threads of the book together, the antebellum lesson was this, sort of by the time we get to the 1850s, in the states, intensive political organizing and the right conditions could lead to repeal of racially discriminatory laws. But at the federal level, no protections for the basic rights of free African Americans would be forthcoming unless something changed very dramatically. And of course, things did change really dramatically. In the 1850s, the longstanding two-party system of that era began to dissolve and the Republican Party took form. And the Republicans actually picked up and carried forward the ideas about racial equality and civil rights that the movement had been developing for a long time. So the last two chapters of the book are about the Civil War and the making of Reconstruction. And I'm just going to touch on that so that I can kind of take you to, to the end, to where I get to by the end of the book, except the epilogue. So the Republicans kind of win big in 1860. That's when Lincoln gets elected and the Republicans become a majority in both houses of Congress. And the kind of major Republican election combined with the secession of 11 Southern states in the winter of 1861, fall of 1860, winter of 1861, tremendous power to reshape federal policy. Now, members of Lincoln's cabinet, like Salmon Chase, William Seward, Edwin Stanton, were all on record as either participants, as in the case of Chase and Seward, or observers in the case of Stanton in the first civil rights movement. They had been aware of these debates. They had been on the side of racial equality and civil rights. And so were many Republicans in Congress, including framers of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, people like Lyman Trumbull of Illinois and John Bingham of Ohio. So these men had been influenced by the arguments made by people like David Jenkins and others who had gathered in Columbus in 1843, who had edited the Palladium of Liberty, that racial discrimination and civil rights should have no place in American life. Not just among citizens, but among all persons. These politicians, who by this time were in the kind of mainstream and in power, had seen how useless the Privileges and Immunities Clause was when it came to protecting free Black people who moved from one state to another. And they knew particularly from the experiences with the states of the Old Northwest that ending slavery itself was not the same as securing racial equality, even in the most basic civil rights. So they knew from experience that you could have a jurisdiction without slavery, but still have racist laws. They had seen that, right, in the North. So now I want to just sort of draw a contrast between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass in the moment, 1865, as the Civil War is ending and the country's heading toward, Reconstruction, whatever that's going to mean. Famously, at a meeting in May of 1865, a meeting of abolitionists in New York City, William Lloyd Garrison kind of famously declared, "Our work as abolitionists is done. The 13th Amendment had passed Congress. It was out for ratification in the states. Slavery, it looked like, was going to be permanently abolished in this country by constitutional amendment." Frederick Douglass at that same meeting said, "No, right? We are not done. And here's why." Douglass insisted that securing the abolition of slavery was not enough, and he offered the Black laws of the Midwest as a cautionary example. He said no one should be surprised if white Southerners denied Black men the right to testify against white men in courts of law. He said, quote, "Our northern states have done it. Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have done it," end quote. The southern states would do the same and more, and the 13th Amendment would not stop them. He said the Constitution's Privileges and Immunities Clause had never worked as well as it was supposed to. He referenced the Massachusetts guy who got run out of Charleston trying to bring a case to federal court. And he said something down in South Carolina is higher than the Constitution's provisions. And so he argued that the movement had to take their fight into the halls of federal power while they had the chance. To restrain the traditional powers of the states, to demand the repeal of racist state laws and the protections promised by the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and ultimately also to secure Black men's right to vote. I write about how that same summer in 1865, we find African Americans throughout the South and the North mobilizing to tell Congress we needed a federal level intervention. We needed federal policy that is going to restrain the states. So for example, a convention in Norfolk, Virginia said, the 13th Amendment, if ratified, would not touch the laws respecting free people of color that predated the war and were presumed to have lost none of their vitality. A South Carolina group protested to Congress against, quote, "any code of Black laws that the legislature of this state may enact." And at the same time, Black Northerners, who had for so long been accustomed to lobbying state legislatures, developed a lobbying organization that would meet in Washington, D.C. and go talk to members of Congress, to the President of the United States, to members of the cabinet, and say, now is the time for a federal policy that will remake the Constitution in ways we know it needs to be remade based on what we have lived through over previous decades, based on what we know about the limitations of the original constitutional order. And so what I'm trying to show by the end here is that even in this moment of extraordinary change, everyone was carrying forward political ideas and vocabularies that had been forged in previous engagements. For many Republicans, this meant channeling the first civil rights movement by invoking the promises of the Declaration of Independence and talking about really the immorality of racist laws and of racial discrimination. And Democrats, by contrast, made recourse to the same old argument long used in the service of white supremacy, that states were entitled under their police powers to identify, regulate, and even exclude populations they considered undesirable. It was the Republican vision of racial equality enforced by federal power that won out for the time being. In the first half of 1866, Congress passed both the first federal civil rights statute, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the 14th Amendment. And the Civil Rights Act declared African-American citizens of the United States and promised citizens of every, quote, race or color, all the same basic rights as, quote, white citizens that white citizens currently enjoyed. And the 14th Amendment constitutionalized the idea of birthright citizenship and declared that states must not deny privileges and immunities of citizenship to any person, nor deny to any person whether they're a citizen or not, the equal protection and the due process of law. And the 15th Amendment, and this book kind of draws a little bit of a line around voting, but the 15th Amendment follows the same principle of anti-racial discrimination, right, in providing that there cannot be discrimination in the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what I'm kind of saying is that these laws that explicitly bar racial discrimination are kind of the culmination of this first civil rights movement. And this is a contrast, which we can talk about. This is a contrast to the way historians of Reconstruction typically talk about these laws as kind of coming out only of the emergency moment of 1865, where Congress looks at what Southern states are doing, passing these Black laws, and says, no, 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 you can't do that. What I'm saying is that the ideas, the language, the sense of what the problem was had been formed over decades previous to this. And now was the opportunity people had to actually bring these ideas into federal policy. Now, these federal measures certainly did not solve the problems that the nation faced as slavery was abolished and kind of Americans tried to grapple for the first time with the abolition of slavery on a national scale. As we know, these policies went unenforced for almost a century, undermined by the Supreme Court and, of course, by raw white supremacy, violent and otherwise. It is also worth noting what this movement did and did not prioritize. The movement's central goal was the repeal, again, of explicitly racist laws. And I kind of talked about how they have a specific critique of what is wrong with discriminating based on race. But most of the people I write about were not actually interested in leveling other distinctions. So, for example, when pressed to say what they really meant when they were talking about equality during Reconstruction, Republicans largely agreed that they were not suggesting that women and men should be treated the same. Moreover, these activists did not attack use of the police powers to monitor and regulate people considered paupers and vagrants. And we see as early as right after the Civil War, Freedmen's Bureau agents and other Northerners in the post-Civil War South who regularly insisted on racial equality before the law, but then felt entirely free to crack down on vagrancy and vagabondage. And then Southern state legislatures in turn quickly adapted to that Republican idiom and new federal policies by abandoning the flagrant Black codes they passed in 1865 in favor of race-neutral statutes that penalized vagrancy and demanded enforcement of labor contracts. So one Freedmen's Bureau official in Alabama observed it this way when he saw what was going on. No reference to color was expressed in terms of the law, he said, but in practice, the distinction is invariable. So they're using facially race-neutral laws to exploit and discriminate basically against Black people in this context, in this post-Civil War Southern context. And of course, to some extent, this was a harbinger of the future and our present. in which we see again and again policies that make no explicit reference to race, but nonetheless have racially disparate impacts. But I'll close with this. As historians, we're in the business of thinking about continuity and change. I think in some ways we should actually be surprised that this nation even got to the place of banning laws that drew explicit distinctions based on race. And the fact that it did owes a great deal to the activists of the first civil rights movement. This movement insisted that laws that discriminated overtly based on race were unacceptable and immoral, and they pushed for their repeal at the state level while pressuring the US government to find a way to act on that principle. It was because of this movement that elected officials were prepared to pursue those ideas in federal policy when the opportunity presented itself. So this movement was actually largely successful on its own terms, due not only to the participants' perseverance and intelligence and creativity, but also due to situations beyond their control, like secession and civil war. So what I tried to show here ultimately is that this movement existed, that it matters in its own right, and that its successes help us better understand the contours of the world that emerged in its wake. And I will stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. And I believe that we have then a good long 30 minutes for questions and comments. Then usually we give preference to those who didn't ask questions yet. Then you can raise your hand by clicking on reactions at the bottom of the screen. Who is going to be the first? Me? Okay, Claire. Let's go. You can go ahead, please.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, Kate. Wonderful talk and a wonderful summary of what sounds like an amazing book. Can you please tell us why it's 1849 in Ohio that those laws succeed? And I'm also wondering if you could say a little bit about, you mentioned a newspaper, I think, called the Palladium and other. Can you tell us a little bit about the dissemination of these ideas, other than, I mean, clearly the Liberators a key one, but a little bit more about how, how the networks, I guess, of these various activists, working for these changes.
Yes, definitely. And hi, Claire, who is a longtime friend who's in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yep, that's right.
So hi, all the way over there, upside down. So why 1849? So, and I kind of tell this story in one of the chapters. I mean, there was, and when I started teaching at Northwestern and started teaching the Civil War and Reconstruction, I started to learn about these third-party movements and it's kind of like an old school kind of literature about the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party and the formation of the Republican Party, which was something that I didn't know very much about when I started doing all this. But truly, there's something incredibly fascinating about, so these people who want to repeal the Black laws in places like Ohio and Illinois, they start, to the extent that they're interested in third-party organizing, they start organizing in the Liberty Party in the early 1840s. And the Liberty Party is an extremely anti-slavery party. It's a party that is pledged to not just talk about the evils of slavery, but also to repeal Black laws in the places where they exist. And that one of the things that, I mean, I don't want to get too out in the weeds, but a lot of historians have gotten really caught up on naming these different categories of so-called abolitionists. So these are called political abolitionists. They're sometimes contrasted to the Garrisonian abolitionists who didn't really want to get involved in politics. Almost everyone that I study, who's part of what I'm talking about, wanted to get involved in politics because they wanted to change policy. And so these people, I don't think, were ideologically, in terms of why and how they thought that slavery and racial discrimination were horrendous, were horrible, immoral institutions. I don't think they were that different from the much better known quote unquote Garrisonians. They just really wanted to channel their energy into political change, among other kinds of change. So anyway, that is all to say, there's a kind of building up of a third-party movement, starting with the Liberty Party in Ohio. The Liberty Party is in lots of different places, but they're very strong in Ohio relatively. And they kind of are trying to get, especially Whigs on their side, and they're trying to run people for governor and change move the Overton window. I mean, is another way of talking about it. They're trying to change the terms of political debate between the two major parties and force through their candidacies for state office, force candidates in the two major parties to talk about the issues that the Liberty Party wanted to talk about. So like trying to change the terms of the political debate, even if they don't have a very good chance of winning statewide office or even getting people into the state legislature. Okay, fast forward 1848, there's this other kind of political shift where you have the Free Soil Party and you have more and more Democrats leaving the Democratic Party. And really the parties are very unstable right now. And all of that ends up meaning that a number of third party people get elected to the Ohio legislature in the 1848 election. And then a bunch of them go back to their old political parties. And then it's left with like two guys who remain independent. And they basically broker a deal with the Democrats in the state legislature to repeal the black laws. And the two major parties are so politically close. I mean, they're so close in terms of numbers that whichever side these two independents throw their weight to is going to be able to pass legislation. And that's actually one of the things that I also learned from this book that I think is really interesting and kind of resonates with some stuff today is a lot of the victories that these people won, they won in very narrow victories. They won barely. Like in Ohio, that was a close call. And yet the implications of what they did were enormous. Not only in Ohio, but then Ohio became a beacon for other people who were trying to get the black laws repealed in their states and talking about we need to do what Ohio is doing. And even as some reactionaries continued to want to bring back the black laws in Ohio, they never did, right? It was like, once they're gone, they're not coming back on the books. So Claire, that's why 1849, the political moment was kind of right. And it was the product of, about a decade of political organizing. As far as, what was your other question?
About the networks, particularly print networks.
So there's an amazing kind of Liberty Party anti-slavery paper run by white people in Cincinnati called The Philanthropist. Another paper that I've gotten like obsessed with, and I'm trying to arrange to get it digitized because it's not digitized, is called The Western Citizen, and it was published out of Chicago. And then there was like Martin Delaney's paper, The Mystery, which I think there's only one issue that survives, but these other papers would run stuff from The Mystery. So you can see a little bit about, so papers are running things that other papers are also running. And so I also want to direct people's attention. I mean, The Liberator is an incredible source and digitized, and they picked up things from other places. But I mean, there are a lot of other sources for tracing these kind of, insurgent politics, and they're disseminating, they're talking about what other people are doing. For example, the Illinois, the Western Citizen published in Chicago is picking up stuff that the Philanthropist in Cincinnati is publishing. Eventually they get a paper called The New Era in DC that's kind of aggregating stuff and doing things on the national level. So, I mean, the print culture is not like the focus of the book, but it is really tremendous to see how these kind of conversations are reverberating in different places.
Thank you, Kate. Do we have questions? I don't see anybody. Then you can just go ahead and raise your hands if you want. Otherwise, I will ask a question. Then, Kate, I am not a historian of the United States. Then just if I am saying anything that is silly, then just consider. But one of the elements that I like in the book, first of all, to see all this put together in the period that is before the Reconstruction, then seeing that this fight for civil rights was occurring then. Usually we think about Reconstruction, but we see here a much earlier period. Then I would have two questions, one that is more specific, another one more general, that if you don't want to answer. The first is regarding the chapter 4, that we have these black sailors and all the restrictions imposed on them. I see a lot of connections, of course, in this chapter regarding all the works that have been done lately regarding then the enslaved people who are also sailors, and how they, the importance they had then for the either because they escaped it, they resisted, and also because they they fought for abolition. And you mentioned in the beginning of the chapter that one of them, that now I don't recall his name, but that he was going to France, then he was traveling to this other, then he was crossing the Atlantic. I asked myself about the international connections of these social actors that you are looking at the book. Then if you found other connections, then in terms of how other thinkers, other Black thinkers, or people who were then traveling back and forth, how they had some kind of impact on these African American men. The other question is perhaps also a reflection about the period that we are now. I ask myself, for example, when you were writing the book, of course, that this occurred through a long period, but it was a difficult period, let's say even somewhat exceptional over the last 4 years. And then you finish and you are publishing the book in a moment when we leave this era, or at least we hope we left the Trump era, but at the same time with a lot of new projects then aiming to restrict the voting rights in specific states. Then the book plays a lot with this tension between the federal level, the national level, and what was done already very early by different states in order to block these rights. And apparently, we see something is still happening in this sense. And I ask myself whether or not you would like to comment.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I think the person you're talking about was Joseph Thompson, who I also, mentioned because he gave this testimony. He'd been to France, and these men who worked on ships. I mean, there's a primarily kind of more domestic trade that goes up and down the Atlantic coast of the United States, but then there's people who are also sailing on ships that are going all over the Atlantic, sometimes the Pacific, obviously the Caribbean. And so the work of Jeffrey Bolster, Michael Shepner's recent book, of course, Julia Scott's work. There are a lot of people who have looked specifically at the ways that ideas about freedom, about cosmopolitanism, about race, about slavery circulated, and that sailors were incredibly important agents of the circulation of ideas. And so I did not focus on that because I was focused elsewhere. And I think in some ways, yes, this is a very kind of nationally bound study. And that's partly because, again, getting back to, it's a lot about trying to change policy. And so it's like, well, where do you look when you're trying to get something done concretely? I mean, you look and try to get your government to change. And that's not the same as how do you circulate ideas, and how do people's ideas, kind of reframe, kind of bounce off of each other and get elaborated in a conversation that wouldn't necessarily have national boundaries, right? And I think some people who are involved in these kind of international conversations about slavery and freedom would also you can take Frederick Douglass as an example, or David Walker, or people who, where people can do both, right? Because you kind of have this broader world that you're talking about, but then it's and also I want my kid to be able to go to public school, right? And so I don't see the two as, kind of mutually exclusive, but my focus in this book was about how do people kind of face the state and make demands on the state. So that's, yeah. I mean, I think that I really think it's federalism and the fact that that's how our government is structured, and the challenges of federalism, particularly with respect to issues of race and generally speaking, issues of inequality, is to me, I'm obsessed with it. I mean, I think it's one of the most important things for anyone who lives in this country to understand, because it will tell us, first of all, the history of the reality that it has been the federal government that has backstopped the rights of African Americans, but other minorities, right? And I'm talking about also sexual minorities, and also women who are not a minority, but anyone who where there's a tendency of governments to infringe on their rights, to say that they don't have rights. It has been the federal government, for all of its, Leviathan qualities that can be very oppressive at the same time. It's been the U.S. government that's backstopped the rights of people when the states have infringed on them. And that has happened over and over again. And it is always the forces of reaction on these issues that want to take away federal oversight and that want to empower the states. And so that was true in the period I'm studying, but before the war, it was true, in Reconstruction, and it is true now when we look at voting rights, when we look at abortion, when we look at Medicare, expansion of Obamacare. And so I'm kind of like, really obsessed with this because I think we can't really understand politics, and we also can't really understand what to do about it if we don't get that, right? And then the converse thing, which is also kind of challenging to think about, is in the Trump era, when they were using the federal government to oppress and repress immigrants, using ICE and bringing ICE into cities where city governments and state governments did not want them. This was a moment where the state side of federalism actually helped people who wanted to stand up for people's rights, right? Because immigrants have a different, legal relationship to these questions of federalism, right? And so in those moments, it felt like certain cities that were, called sanctuary cities, either in a positive or negative way, and certain states resisting ICE, resisting federal power, we're doing the thing that, it has an ambiguous valence, right? We also saw tremendous resistance by the residents of Chicago and many other northern places to the Fugitive Slave Act, to enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. And so even though the prevailing point over time is that it's the US government that's going to backstop people's rights, it's also sometimes the states that are going to stand up when it's the federal government that is charging ahead, with these kind of really repressive policies. So I will talk about that till the cows come home, because I think, for everyone who wants to think about what is going on here, we have to understand all this. Sorry, get off my high horse.
No, it's great. Thank you, Kate. You have a question from Alex. Let's go, Alex.
Hi. Am I unmuted? My Zoom is saying that I need to unmute myself, but I am fine. Zoom is lying to me again. So I just want to follow up a little bit, because one of the things, of course, this book, one of the things why I really loved it so much is because it actually shifted my view on several things, and or filled in the gaps of my ignorance. But one of them is, of course, this kind of argument you start with early about how this European traditions that deal with vagrancy kind of start playing this very important role. And of course, this kind of trajectory then even leads to the creation of a nativist party, which I didn't actually know about the nativist party. But to me, it's interesting that because in your focus on nationalism, there are a couple of threads here that could be explored a little further in the 19th century. I'm thinking of the Pace Act in 1875 that leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I think at first it was gendered in the beginning, right? Because we have this is about preventing women from traveling from China in 1875, and then of course becomes the more broad Chinese Exclusion Act. But it kind of seems to have this line that draws back to your arguments here, and even the people already fighting on the ground, as May and Guy argues in her book on the Chinese question recently, are already kind of like also drawing from that tradition of the early civil rights that you outlined here. And I wonder if you had thought about these kind of connections, even within the 19th century, taking place within the expanding territory of the US. Like how it leads to eventually our conversations about ICE today, right? That you just brought up.
Well, the immigration, there's so much to say here. So the idea that the anti-Black laws that I'm talking about were basically immigration laws. So we can wrap our minds around that for a second, right? These are actually immigration laws that are designed to discourage immigration of African Americans across state lines, and they are using a vocabulary about, dependency and unwanted immigrants versus wanted immigrants, right? That draws on the English poor laws. And that set of ideas about who's a desirable and undesirable immigrant come across whatever line you're talking about. Here it's a state line, but it could be county lines, because counties are how the poor laws work. You would like deport an undesirable poor person, a vagrant or whatever, across state line or county lines back to their county of origin, to the federal level, right, which happens after the Civil War. So just to, like, in case people are more interested in this, I mean, the best earliest thing that I read about making this connection was Kunal Parker's work, who is a law professor who started writing about these state laws as immigration laws, and then wrote a book in the Cambridge History of American Law series on the history of American immigration. Hidetaka Hirota, who has a book on the history of American immigration law that starts when states were primarily in charge of foreign immigration, right? So the federal government doesn't actually start dealing with foreign immigration very much until after the Civil War, and they get ramped up about it because of Chinese immigration. So in the years before the war, it's really Massachusetts and New York, and to some extent other states, that are like making their own immigration policies vis-a-vis people from abroad, and that's what Hirota's book is about. And both of them write about how immigration policy draws on this poor law tradition. And then, sort of, so you can kind of bring it, you can sort of, and there's more work coming out about this, I should say. And then Beth Lou Williams' wonderful book that kind of talks about the sort of early days of federal restriction of Chinese immigration. So you can, I think Kunal Parker's short book might be the best, or sort of attempt to bring it all together. But, I think that's actually an area where we want to see more scholarship and making these connections and really thinking about borders. I think it's very interesting. I mean, internal borders within the United States. I think it's very easy for us living in our own time to think less about internal borders within the United States, because many of the things that make it hard, that used to make it harder for people to cross those state borders, or have gone away, have been made to go away. But that especially for those of us who are interested in the 19th century, state borders had particular kind of meanings that, particularly for people who were not white men, that are worth, continuing to think about.
Thank you. And they might have those again. If, for example, abortion laws start taking hold of the South, we might start seeing some of those borders meaning something again.
Right. Well, it's already clear that on many issues, what state you live in will have a lot to do with what rights you are able to exercise, right? That's true with voting at this point. That's true with abortion, for sure. It's true with access to healthcare. So that's, I mean, it's not about necessarily barriers to crossing borders, but it is true that, like, what we can do really at this point, there's a certain amount of lack of homogeneity in people's experiences. And I think the more vulnerable of a person you are, the more likely those differences are to matter.
Thank you. Any more questions coming from here? I don't see any. Then we still have about 10 minutes. If you have questions or comments, please go ahead. We see some messages in the chat. We have Amanda Kleintop. Okay, please, Amanda, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. I also want to say thanks to the organizers. I'm a longtime lurker, if you will, first time active participant. And hi, Kate, it's good to see you. I wondered if I could turn the conversation to the process of writing this book, which will not surprise you probably. I was wondering, and this comes a little bit from me being at Northwestern while you were working on the book. So I saw like workshops and early stages of chapters. And I was wondering if you always envisioned this book from the framework of the first civil rights movement. And if not, like how it developed into that and what like major themes played into it. Thank you.
Sure. The idea of the first civil rights movement kind of came on late-ish in the process. So there's also another thing which we haven't really talked about, which is, what are civil rights? How do I define civil rights? What are you even talking about when you say this? And I actually always was writing about what I understood to be civil rights as 19th century people understood civil rights. So like, in other words, when they talked about civil rights, they usually were talking about the rights to kind of personal mobility, as well as to enter into contracts, to sue and be sued, to own property. Yeah, those were, and to testify in court, right? To have access to the legal system. Usually when 19th century people talked about civil rights, they did not include the right to vote. So they called that a political right. The right to hold office, they called that a political right. So I always knew that I was primarily interested in things that 19th century people understood as civil rights. And I also purposely kind of wanted to bracket the right to vote a little bit, because I could see that these arguments, for example, about the Ohio Black laws, like of African Americans in Ohio definitely wanted the right to vote for Black men, but they also wanted the repeal of all these other laws, right? And because of the ways people talked about the range of different types of rights or places you could have equality, you could sort of cordon some off and say, we want these, but not those, or something like that. So I think I wanted to make sure that I didn't short shrift the things people understood to be civil rights, because they seem to be like really, really important, even though we also know that the right to vote is really important and had to enter into the story in certain ways. And also it's not just that, it's also like, and this is kind of really nerdy, I don't even know if I can really say this, but it's also about the production of the idea of civil rights. So it's not even like this was a society that was 100% focused on rights in the first place. Like they had to kind of amplify the idea of rights, period, and then say that they wanted racial equality in these types of rights. So they're actually in some ways producing the category of civil rights by talking about it all the time, because you had all of these other ways that people talked about human experience in terms of law and stuff, including especially in terms of police powers and all the things you didn't have rights to do, right? This was not a society that was super focused on rights, and certainly was not focused on equality. And so the people I'm talking about were actually pushing a kind of discourse of rights and racial equality into the center in ways that it hadn't been before. But I still didn't really think about it. I didn't really think about it as a civil rights movement, in part because I'm so picky about feeling like it's not a movement for civil rights, it's a movement for racial equality and civil rights. Like, and so, but it is a movement specifically for racial equality and civil rights. So I suppose if the book title could have been a lot longer, it would have been like America's First Movement for Racial Equality and Civil Rights. But that was probably not going to fly with my publisher, my editor. So, but I do think, like I was also, when thinking about that subtitle, did not mind kind of implicitly connecting with what people understand to be civil rights movements, just because I think this, it's helpful and interesting, I hope, to have this in that longer history, right? Even though I'm not making an argument that for the super long civil rights movement, or, that this was I'm not saying that this was continuous with, what happened in Reconstruction necessarily, or certainly not what happened in the 20th century or today, but just putting it in that context, I think I'm fine with. So that's kind of a long answer, but yeah, it kind of evolved in answer to your question, Amanda, and thank you for reading workshop drafts back in the day.
Thank you. We have space for one more. Kate, would you like to tell us a little bit about what you are planning for your what kind of next project in terms of then writing project, if it will derive from this one, if you have what you are doing? Then I know that you mentioned two of the projects that I had that I read in your bio, but are there any projects in terms of writing that are coming out from this one?
I'm working on you mean like spin-offs of this book?
Yes.
Or additional? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, the project that I'm doing with the Colored Conventions Project is going to be a web exhibit on African-American life and activism in Illinois in the 1840s and 50s. And that is kind of a spin-off from this. There was a fair amount of stuff from Illinois that ended up on the cutting room floor. And plus here I am in Illinois. And Colored Conventions Project, run by Gabrielle Foreman and her team, they didn't have anyone who had worked on the Illinois conventions yet. And so in the spring of 2020, just as we were all going online for the pandemic, I taught an undergraduate seminar on the Illinois Black Conventions of 1853 and 1856. And then I've had the good fortune of having a couple of summer research teams of undergrads and grad students working on this project last summer remotely and this summer also remotely. And we've done a lot of original kind of research, and I'm really excited about it. And alongside that, I guess I'm working on a paper for a different project that this is unrelated to the website, but I also got interested in the relationship between these laws and kind of vigilantism and kind of everyday violence. And so for Illinois, I'm doing a kind of standalone paper on that connects the fight against these racially discriminatory laws in Illinois with the weird way that violence was in pockets. And basically, like, everyone's breaking the law all the time. Right. So you have these laws and you have these activists who want to repeal the laws. So obviously the laws matter to them. And yet, you know, the people, the racially egalitarians, the abolitionists are breaking the law by not, or you don't even have to be an abolitionist, by not enforcing the registration laws. They're constantly not enforced. They're not enforcing the registration laws, or they're helping fugitives escape from slavery against the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, or they're, you know, and so they're breaking the law. And then you have the white supremacist violence people who are also breaking the law by going around and threatening people and taking away their property and running them out. And so, I mean, I'm kind of interested in this kind of lawlessness and what is the relationship between laws and lawlessness in this period when it comes to these issues. So I'm thinking about that a little. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you so much to all of you who came here today. And just to remind you that the book that we discussed today from Kate Masur, who is an associate professor at Northwestern University, that I'm not sure if I mentioned that in my introduction. And the book is titled Until Justice Be Done, published this year, 2021, by Norton. And I hope you get the book. It's a beautiful book and a brilliant book that is really important for the period that you are in now. And let me just see if you have, okay, and I just want to invite you to the next one, the next Slavery Archive Book Club, that is this Saturday at 1 p.m. You are going to have Federica Morelli from University of Torino, and we will be discussing this book, Free People of Color in the Spanish Atlantic, Race and Citizenship, 1780-1850, that in some ways overlaps the topic that we discussed here regarding the United States. Otherwise, go to www.slaveryarchive.wordpress.com, and you are going to have the entire schedule for the next weeks. We have 4 talks in September, 2 in October, 1 or 2 in November, and 1 last in December. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you again, Kate, for this great book, and thank you for participating of this in this book club. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.